Hello and welcome to the Real Life Podcast, episode 24. This podcast is now 2 years old. Over 2 years ago, because I obviously missed the deadline for meeting this anniversary, I released episode 1 talking about my favourite football films. I haven't listened to it since uploading because I think it would hurt me to do so. But I thought, episode 1, what would be easy? Take two things I love, football and film, slam them together and hopefully that'll go well. And it went alright. But I did want to say something about this podcast itself, which I will leave to the end so people don't, lose their rag with me and switch off. But in celebration of the birthday of the pod, I've planned two things. Number one, this is now episode 1 of season 3 of the podcast. I think I may mark the series of the pods as being at or around Oscar time, thereby meaning every March to May. That's a bit of leeway so that I can be useless. It'll be a different season every time around then. So, welcome, you lot, to season 3 of the Real Life Podcast. I've just realised it'll be 3 things that I'm doing because now I need to think of a name for all of the listeners, a collective group, an all-encompassing term, if you will. Realize is what I've got at the minute, but it's a bit shit. So I'm going to ask around and get back to you, so be ready to become labelled something in the near future. I'm going to try and give you a bit of an everything episode, is the other thing I was going to say. As much as I can on my own, because I'm on my ones today, so this pod will not only have a review of a very recent popular release, but also a big, fat discussion about a heavy concept in filmmaking. This episode might feel all over the place, and it is, but I recently had a conversation which was timed beautifully with some things that I've seen recently, so today I'm going to talk challenges. Having seen it the other day and been absolutely fascinated by it, that may be the first focus of this pod, but I'm also going to talk further about several other titles and how they link to the concepts of pulpiness, indulgence, and why brevity is important. The other titles I'm going to talk about for anyone who fancies sticking around are Doctor Who, Babylon, and a light touch of Tarantino. It's actually quite a heavy touch of Tarantino, but it's going to be a fairly basic setup on my overall thoughts on him because I'm saving the in-depth stuff for a later episode. This may sound like a meandering mess of a podcast, ironically, given the subject matter, but I promise you it has a point, and whenever that Tarantino episode comes around, this is a good precursor for it. Interestingly, I don't think Challenges is in any way at all a big offender for the issue of indulgence. God, so many twists in this intro. But on pulpiness, boy oh boy, this film takes a big, fat, pulpy biscuit. So, without further ado, let's talk about some overly erotic and very, very moist tennis. So here's a brief overview of Challenges, directed by Luca Guadagnino, who directed Call Me By Your Name, Bones and All, and Suspiria, so a really interesting filmography so far, very sort of in-your-face, but with really interesting themes and cleverly done stuff. So Zendaya plays Tashi, a tennis player turned coach, after a career-ending injury at college. She has transformed her husband, Art Donaldson, played by Mike Feist, from an average player into a Grand Slam champion. But to motivate him back to his very best after a string of poor results, she makes him play a challenger tournament at the very bottom of the tour ladder. Art, then himself standing across the net from the once promising, now burnt out Patrick Zweig, his former best friend, and Tashi's former boyfriend, played by Josh O'Connor, has to reconcile his form. It's a film sort of unlike anything you've seen in a while. It revels in all the beauty of sporting life, taking very seriously every element, regardless of the level that they're at. Guadagnino treats every tiny element of being a sportsman like an intimate moment, and obviously given a romance setting, that fits wonderfully. It is the definition of pulpy. You know how Gone Girl is David Fincher at his most pulpy? This is so pulpy you don't even believe it. The OED defines pulpy as sensationalist and of poor quality, trashy. But to me, that isn't quite what it means in these contexts. I know I'm literally about to try and rewrite the dictionary here, but to me it means more along the lines of sensationalist, yes, and very much reveling in its over-the-topness, but in a beautifully enjoyable way. Challenges is far better than the trashy described by the OED, but it is silly and overly serious, and it knows it, and for that you can only sort of watch and applaud. One of the key things to note is that absolutely everyone in this is acting their socks off. There's not a dull performance or one single missed note in the entire piece. The three main characters are all so fantastic as we continue to watch Zendaya mould herself into a properly believable and engaging actor. She's so brilliant in this and does a great job in playing someone difficult to read, tunnel visioned and harsh in some scenes, which could be written to fall down. You really do believe how focused and cold she is. The key to understanding how good everyone is in this is that Art Donaldson is the only one who's kind of redeemable. Despite his jealousy-based tactics at college, both Tashi and Patrick are stone-cold bastards and could so easily be desperately overdrawn caricatures, but both Zendaya and Josh O'Connor are so brilliant at their job that you actually believe in their possible existence. Mike Feist is also just fantastic. I cannot wait to see more of him because I thought he was utterly brilliant in this. He made you feel sorrow, frustration, exhaustion. He was really properly good, and he's an excellent presence the whole way through, and it ends up being who you want to side with. Perhaps the pulpiness comes for most people in this from two places: the tennis and the music. I'll start with tennis. I love tennis. I get absolutely glued to the slams, and despite being shite at it, whilst my best mate Matt is absolutely unreal, there you go, you can have that one, I think it's a wicked sport, and I know what a proper game looks like, having watched hours and hours of it, and for the most part, Luca G has made it look really quite good, particularly at the challenger level, and the coaching the actors had has obviously paid off, because outside of a couple of pacing issues, and let's be fair here, they're actors, not tennis players, so cut them some bloody slack, they are very convincing. But for the love of God, it was like a Python sketch. Every single time there was a slow motion shot, which was a fucking lot. I mean, Jesus Christ, it happened so many times. It was stupid. But every time they turn around in slow motion, they had more and more liquid pouring down their face. It was honestly ridiculous. I know people sweat, right? And it's elite athlete level sports, but it made it look like their Madame Tussauds waxworks were just melting. It was so distracting. Aside from that, most professional players will celebrate most points quietly, if at all, but the bigger points, they tend to give a little bit more vigour to the celebration. What got very grating for me was the idea of, after every point, turning to look pensively into the crowd to see what Zendaya thought. Just, do get on with it. I mean, this game is only at 30-15. You haven't won shit yet, so stop smouldering at the good-looking lady in the crowd for, I know it's the plot. I know that's what the whole thing is about, but not every time, for crying out loud. Obviously, the difference here is that these guys are challengers. Well, I mean, Art isn't, but that's the level he's been reduced to playing at to regain his form. So, actually, the whole love triangle goes some way to explaining why neither of them are at the top of their game. As for the music, it's fascinating. That's sort of how I describe the whole film, to be honest. All of it is just absolutely fascinating in an engaging way, despite it being pretty ridiculous a lot of the time. The music has two modes: very, very loud pounding techno and very intriguing, slightly altered and melodic minor rather than melodic and minor, if you know what I mean, for all the music nerds. An alteration of one of their previous scores. It's Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross doing the music, and I love Reznor Ross. I do. I think they're actual geniuses who make such sick music. They wrote my favourite film score of all time in the shape of Empire of Light, which is why that second feature of the music got me so very excited. The main kind of more calm moments where the characters get to know each other in their complicated, intimate way uses the same melody that Reznor and Ross used for the track High Windows from Empire of Light, which in that film plays over the top of Olivia Colman and Michael Ward's blossoming relationship. In this, it plays a similar role, but its alteration into the occasional minor variation makes the love feel more complicated and trickier. There's games to play here, and this isn't actually quite love. It's more like infatuation in the dangerous sense. It's a really brilliant change, and I haven't heard composers take ideas from themselves so quickly in recent memory. You could call it lazy, but actually it really isn't, because it's changed enough to make it a really clever and interesting idea. And it isn't just sort of blatantly ripping itself off, it's doing it for a purpose. It must also be said that the music sometimes sounds like something straight out of the holdovers, as fairly children-based choral music sounds over some of the moments, which I must say I didn't like, but, you know, it added to the heightened silliness of the whole thing. The sound mixing is interesting, and it feels like there's no way it can't be deliberate. You know in Tenet, when you just get completely lost because you can't hear a bloody thing, so you do what Nolan wants you to do and rewatch it 3 times so you do understand. Well, this isn't that. It feels like lazy criticism, or as Kermode would describe it, straight to the heart of the periphery film criticism. What's happening is, I think, a different effect, slightly. It's nowhere near as genius. It obviously isn't remotely subtle, but it reminds me of the part of The Social Network where they're in the club and the music is turned all the way up. The effect is to make you lean forward. By giving you most of the scene at a volume by which you can hear it, when the music ramps up, you want to hear the conclusion. It's essentially a reassurance measure that you're invested in the events of the scene and the characters within it. And I think that's clever, you know, the idea of getting you to lean forward and make sure you're paying attention and you're really clinging on to every word. Having said that, heart of the periphery aside, it is too loud and too much on multiple occasions, and that's just the way it is. That gets grating and frustrating and a bit silly. The whole thing is a bit silly, I understand, but there are also really important silences, like in the bedroom scene that everyone's gone mad about in the trailer. It lets us stop relying on, you know, reinforced musical cues and instead lets us live and breathe the slightly awkward silences of the characters as they progress towards a place we did not think they would end up from the trailers alone, by the way. So don't trust the trailer, because it will actually surprise you, I think, in the way that it goes about its narrative. That scene's actually really clever, because it's that idea of men being so enamored in someone hot that they would, within minutes, have flaked to the point of divulging their darkest secrets that they would normally have taken to the grave. It's very funny. There are a few moments in this when I did find myself genuinely laughing. There's some really sharp writing, and the culmination of that scene is a one-shot sequence which is a bit uncomfortable to watch, but because of the camera placement, finds you moving your head in a very interesting way. When you think about it, it's quite a simple idea, but there are several shots of people watching tennis, particularly Zendaya, when obviously the head moves left to right and then back from right to left. And that's simple. The ending of that bedroom scene is like that movement, watching tennis, moving from left to right. And that's simple but clever, and it makes you think that tennis is probably, weirdly, quite a good arena to display a love triangle in. There's also some clever head-turning stuff later on when Zendaya appears to be moving against the crowd, because she obviously knows better, until she doesn't. There is a real focus on ego, obviously, and the phallic imagery is therefore all to see in quite some manner. Churros and bananas being eaten, etc., and some of the costuming's clever. I read that the whole film hinges on the match between Art and Patrick. It hinges on a really interesting costume idea in the form of Patrick's shorts. They look very much like pajamas, and that kind of just felt provocative of him to me. Like he was reminding Tashi of their previous engagements, or he felt comfortable and at ease, but, you know, it could also just be a nod to the fact that the bloke is literally living out the back of his car for much of the film. Josh O'Connor will be remembered as just one of those excellent actors down the line. You know, expect him to be a Hollywood stalwart with a huge attraction of a name. He's delightfully slimy in this. It's an excellently egotistical performance, and I mean that in the best way possible. His little giggles that he has with Mike faced remain relatively consistent over the years, yet their context changes despite each scene, and I think that's a fascinating thing to watch. Obviously, with ego, you can make a case that the pulpy side of things maybe is a good way to do it. It is, however, quite heavy-handed in a number of places without the charm. First off, I don't want all the time cards. I much prefer subtle visual cues, which means you don't have to be as ham-fisted when it comes to moving non-linearly. In Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, for example, obviously the greatest spy movie of all time, there's no debate on that, Gary Oldman gets new glasses in the period that is 5 years later. That way you know when he's old and when he's new based simply off his glasses. And it's done occasionally here with hairstyles or wind, and yet still the time cards do keep popping up, and it's a little bit frustrating. Also, these two characters have a dynamic that's really unusual, and things don't work the way they normally do in relationships, so let's make love because That's how it works, apparently. That gets on my nerves quite a lot. The counter to that is the scene where Art is sad and nervous to upset Tashi with his decision, which hurts her a lot. She's been irredeemably horrible to him, and that makes the absurdity of this whole affair emotionally hit home. And that's a good moment. It's just frustrating we have to get through some absurdity to get there. The wind ruining the billboard of Tashi and Art is very much the rat in The Departed. You know, the rat symbolises obviousness, and that sort of thing is the megaphone for the people in the back. We've done that several times, I'm not going to do it again. But, you know, hey-ho, it gives it more widespread appeal, I suppose. It's here, however, that we'll leave challenges there as a springboard to a wider chat. Excess and conciseness. The difference between them, the battle that goes on there. In a chat with my mate Georgie, she asked me why it was that films being stripped back, concise or efficient is actually important. Why is that a good thing? You know, it's a good question to ask. You know, that was after we'd had our inevitable Kill Bill argument again. I'm going to now attempt to talk through one of the most complicated debates in the whole of film criticism history. So wish me luck. So, why is conciseness important? Why is most of the time shorter better? In my eyes, it's about the quality of your storytelling. I would call it a greatly impressive display of artistic ability by being able to encompass more of what you're trying to convey in a smaller selection or set of images. It shows you being able to be in control of your creation. Sometimes there may well be a need to say the same thing but in a more concise way. Often in life, when someone like me all the time drones on by failing to be concise, and believe me, that's like massive failing number one of many, I admit, but people lose their attention to whatever bollocks it is that I'm spouting. Of course, if people were paying attention, then they'd know what I was saying was very intelligent and worth listening to, but that's by the by. There was a famous producer in Hollywood called Roger Corman, and he was a very well-known strategist when it came to dealing with directors. Essentially, his philosophy was that you take someone who wants to be a well-respected art house director and you get them to make Carnosaur, something I've obviously heard Kermode talk about here. So, you know, the point of it is that by imparting restrictions on ambitious filmmakers, you get them to work without excess. And I'm a firm believer that people make better films when they have limitations on their work to try and deal with. I'm not going to do a Tarantino deep dive here, as I mentioned, because that's most definitely its own podcast. But the thing about Tarantino's work is that Reservoir Dogs, you know, was absolutely fantastic, stripped down with delightful dialogue, which emphasized the idea that story is character. But out of it, Harvey Weinstein described Miramax, who picked up the film, as the house that Quentin built. And that gave Tarantino the ability to be in a position where his filmmaking could sort of be almost whatever it wanted to be. Within reason, of course, but the result is stuff like The Hateful Eight, which, whilst having fun moments and sequences in it, is absurdly long for what it is, and has an intermission in the middle of it, followed by the director himself reminding us what happened prior to the intermission. We wouldn't have needed a reminder, Quentin, if you didn't have this desire to have an intermission and then come back and go, when we last saw our characters, they were... And it's like, really? Must we? Without those Roger Corman limitations, you give yourself the opportunity to do everything. So you don't cover everything enough, therefore it's thin, therefore it's overblown, therefore it's boring and ill-disciplined, and nobody stands over you with a big stick to stop you from going too far. Now, obviously, the big stick thing, I can appreciate sometimes it is limiting in the bad way, and that's something to note here, is limitations can also be a bad thing, but I also think that no limitation is actually worse, but that's my opinion. Indulgence is something which really bugs me, because I suppose the question is this: if you can tell your story in a more succinct way, why wouldn't you? Something like The Northman, which I had really mixed feelings about. I thought its script was incredibly annoying, but some of it looked absolutely astonishing. It has real impact and wow factor with its harshness and brutality, which works really well for a good while, but eventually it just becomes indulgent for the director as they start reveling in things too much. Tarantino himself said in an interview I heard with him, "I'm making movies for me." And I understand what he's saying. If you want your project to be good, you have to have personal passion for it. If you want to make something you'd enjoy so that you'd have the ability to make it properly. You know, it's like doing a dissertation. You pick something you're interested in so you're motivated to make it good. The problem is that means sometimes you forego what the audience would feel. they might tire of you or the methodology that you're using. Now, that's not to say that you have to move fast all the time, because you really, really don't. You can absolutely take the time to let people bask in this world building that you've done. I'm all for letting things breathe, taking time, leaving space where it needs to be, being patient, being immersive, being experiential. I'm 100% all in on it. I don't want that misconstrued. All of this is brilliant, right? Take Dunkirk, because it's a really patient film. Nolan lets things breathe and keeps a lot of space with a script that's only 76 pages long, but it's his shortest film by a long way, at around 90 minutes. I think probably excluding following there, but you can absolutely have both. But there are times when things can be long and not make it an issue. Which brings me on to the question of, can Indulgence be good? The really helpful answer is, it depends. I often say that most things could probably be made better by losing a bit of their runtime, and not even in a TikTok, ooh, I can't stand things longer than 12 seconds and I need someone playing GTA underneath it whilst I'm watching way. I'm not a heathen. Trust me, I can spend a long time watching a film. You do not have to make me try hard to do that. I have seen John Dillman, I have seen, The Irishman and Killers, all this kind of stuff. It's just about efficiency. Something like Killers of the Flower Moon is really, really long, and it could be a bit shorter. Yeah, probably. Some of the stuff with, Brendan Fraser and the crew could go, yada yada, but, in all honesty, it has every right to be as long as it is. It's fucking wonderful, and in a few years, I think it'll be held as one of the great films of, recent times. It needs that time that it takes to properly tell its story. It needs it, and that's the key thing. When stories don't need to take as much time as they do, Kill Bill does not need to be 2 films. It simply doesn't. Now, there is obviously an important to make here, David, which is the Tories. Sorry, that's a really stupid and niche gag, but anyway, the Tories. No, the point to be made is that indulgence and inefficiency are 2 very different things. So, sometimes films just take a bit too long to get where they're going and slow down the pace for the audience. To me, that's stuff like Blade Runner 2049, which is brilliant, but is too slow and too long. Something stupid like The Holiday, or even The Godfather, which has great characters in it, but, my view is that once you appreciate the intimidation and the cleverness of hard rules of business played by Corleone and the like, there isn't actually much deeper going on there. Those aren't necessarily indulgent films inherently, but they don't pace themselves right, and they need nudging along a bit more. They fall into the inefficient category. Indulgence is stuff like Tarantino actually turning up in Django Unchained, or Robert Eggers in The Northman deciding that we need another set of beheadings. Really? Roger Corman would look at that and just go, yeah, absolutely not. Let's just cut that off. Now, I can actually enjoy some of the Tarantino indulgences, like some of his needle drops, or reveling in some of his history-changing moments where you just go, fuck it, yeah, why the hell not? Let's burn Hitler, let's kill the Mansons, yeah, why not? There's times where you go, yeah, cool. But there's also times where you go, yeah, nice record collection, mate, but what about the story? Can we get on with this? When it comes to challenges, there is absolutely indulgence in this. I don't know if I've heard that many critics say it, so I could possibly be barking up the wrong tree, but it would be ridiculous to assume that some of this stuff wasn't indulgent, particularly when Luca G texts Reznor Ross that this project is going to be really sexy, and then you get loads of shots of sweaty slow motion tennis and a bit too heavy on the music, and despite its effort at story, real reveling in the love bits, there you see the indulgence. Now, it's a little bit of a problem for me because self-serving stuff isn't lending itself to better storytelling. It becomes surplus to requirements. Marina Hyde said something whilst I was listening to The Rest is Entertainment about how it slightly annoys her when filmmakers start making things for their kids. I think it was about John Krasinski making If, because why should we be factored into their parenting methods? We don't care, we have our own stuff to get on with. And of course it was said a bit in jest, of course, but it's a salient point. You start to lose interest when you realise that a director is working for themselves and not for the story. And that's a crucial distinction. Not to pander to the audience and just show them what they want to see, but to sacrifice the story. The story and the characters are the primary thing to service, not yourself or an audience-pleasing series of events or one particularly nice image. The problem when you prioritise the audience leads to stuff like Doctor Who. I'm writing the script for this episode just after Boom has aired, so that's episode 3 of the new Ncuti Gatwa series, which was really intriguing as an episode. But fundamentally, I still don't know who this new era of Doctor Who is for. I don't know who it's pleasing, because it isn't setting itself the same narratorial standards it used to reach. You can see Indulgence bursting out of it. That indulgence comes when the programme morphs into something silly. Doctor Who's always had a large element of camp injected right into its DNA. And it would be stupid to assume that wasn't the case, and you'd have to be a proper killjoy to groan about that, right? Because it's always been a lot of fun. But I have to ask questions like this. Do you think for a moment that in Russell T Davies' first stint running a show that he would have had multiple impromptu musical numbers? Not a chance. Not even close. What he did do was weave into the story and make music service the characters. Hence, John Sim wheeling old David Tennant around the deck of the Valiant to I Can't Decide by the Scissor Sisters. That so works, and it's so wonderfully camp, but it works because that is about the characters. It's about the story. And it's wild to me that people who care about Doctor Who and its recent history in particular would be watching the episodes thinking, God, I wish this would break out into song and dance. I'm sorry, but that's absolutely ridiculous. I actively stopped caring during the Christmas special because I couldn't bear how not seriously it was taking itself. It became the OED definition of pulpy, not my definition. You can't just slap emotion down in the middle of an episode and expect it to work when up until that point you'd been deterring anyone that was hoping to experience the sort of programme they saw that dealt with the adventures in the First World War, issues with disease, historical unsolved mystery, clever concepts like never-ending traffic, a monster you can't see that repeats everything. Even stuff like the 2D People, also side note, Midnight is absolutely the best episode ever, and I'm willing to die on this hill. Loads of those stories still contain buckets of camp and silliness and fancifulness that we all loved. But there's something wrong with Doctor Who since Moffat left, I think. The issue sort of comes down to this. I sort of resent being shown something emotional when I'm then reminded a few moments later, oh no, this is stupid now. You've lost the credibility of the actual story because it's packaged around with so much paraphernalia and nonsense that it doesn't sit well with me. That is sort of my problem with Interstellar. Some of the moments are so emotional and they are just experiential thrill rides that you don't want to get off and that you're hooked onto, and they're incredible. But then you're reminded the dust is coordinates. There's a rocket behind a wall. Hey Murph, I came back. Bye. And all this stuff is kind of like, you're annoying me. You're not getting to the point of it, and you're actually packing around all the emotional stuff, which I am invested in, with stupid bits around it, and that is a problem. Obviously, back to Doctor Who, Flux was dreadful, and Chibnall, bless him, I know he was trying, but he couldn't run a bath, because he just kept pumping out boring story after dreadful story after horrendous script after wooden acting. It was just unwatchable at times. It really, really was. With the new RTD era, the giggle was camp massively and had another musical number in it, which, you know, was a little over the top, but the whole episode was a really fun idea, played out well and without too much in the way of telling, not showing, overindulgence and inefficiency. Each of the specials was, at the very least, a well-contained story, and other than the Star Beast, they were efficiently and effectively done. But the best was without a doubt Wobbly on there, because it was patient. This new series had gotten overexcited now, and actually some of the best Doctor Who ever was less giddy. It was softer, quieter, and let itself breathe. It went for substance over fun or spectacle, like, you know, Human Nature and the Family of Blood, or The Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit. 4 of the best episodes in the show's history. And why? Because they weren't just too giddy with everything. Yes, they revelled in the silly bits and went wild and did mad things, and they were camp, but they were, at their heart, emotional and well thought out stories which embedded the emotional messages and themes in these strange worlds, and not just making things stupid around them and packing them with unnecessary paraphernalia, which, you know, you see it on all the time on social media, people picking out the specific emotional moments from the episode and going, look, it's back, this is so good, this is what we wanted. And I'm going, yeah, I love that moment, that's great, you know, look at Ncuti standing on a landmine and crying, it's such a brilliantly emotional scene, but all of these episodes are packaged with stupid stuff around it. I also think that the show is missing the hands of someone like Euros Lyn, who was able to direct episodes with proper pace, delicious framing, composition and emotion. And I mean, what actually happened in the episode with the Beatles? Outside of Maestro being a fun villain, but a million miles over the top, because of course, Jinx Monsoon's a drag performer, used to heightened modes of performing because, their job requires a more vigorous energy than regular screen acting. So is it any surprise that there's then far too much face pulling, head turning, and a fucking wink to the camera in the episode? That's where the issue lies. It isn't silly in the guise of good story, it's silly because it wants to be. And who on earth is that for? Because you reach a point where it can be for kids and kids only, which episode 1 would appear to suggest, which was rubbish. The danger with that is you make it impossible for people to act strongly. I love Ncuti Gatwa. I think he's a king amongst men. He's a delight. He's an utterly brilliant actor. I think he's a wonderful human being. I think he's funny. He seems really warming. But I think he says some of the lines wrong. And that's an insane thing for me to say for such a talented actor, but it may well come from my expectations of what the show is. I can completely understand that this may all be due to my expectations. I expect a certain level of genuine seriousness from Who, a new Who in particular. A certain level of story, patience, character, stakes, but when that's absent, as it is in what we've seen more recently, how on earth do you deliver those lines? And that's the problem. There isn't quite a right answer. I'm not simply doing that old fanboy thing of, well, I always thought it was this, and so if it isn't this, I don't like change, and that's not right, and I don't like it, because I do not want to fall into that category. I absolutely don't. My favourite Star Wars film is The Last Jedi. Fight me. But I just want the mechanics of the show to allow it to explore all the different themes it uses in a way which doesn't compromise itself. If it wants to be for kids, that's fine. I want it to go ahead and ride that wave and go and do mad things and entertain kids. That's what I want it to do if it wants to be doing that. But I want it to know that, and I want it to tell me that, because people are still watching it under the guise of maybe seeing some of the hard-hitting emotional stuff that we'd seen for the whole of, 2005 to 2014. Like, that's a long period of time where the show was emotional and hard-hitting and breathed, and it let itself tell stories in genuine ways, and it felt real. It didn't feel like this far off thing. And obviously with the Disney money, it's going to look spectacular, of course, we know that, but it's sacrificing some of the elements, I think, that made it really good. So where am I going with this? Well, I think your piece, whatever it is, it has to know what it's doing. It has to know what its aim is. And if its aim is to be pulpy, in my definition, something like Gone Girl, then you can absolutely get away with it, of course. If you want it to just be a silly show, then you can, of course, get away with it. If you want to be indulgent, then you have to label it as such. Otherwise, you end up pretending to be telling a good, interesting, or important story when actually what you're doing is just pleasing your own wants from the film. You end up with Mike Myers in Inglourious Basterds. Mike Myers in Bohemian Rhapsody is funny, it sort of makes sense. But in Inglourious Basterds, it's so unnecessary and it makes the film worse. Oh, they call them the bastards. Do they? Right, yeah, cool. Thanks for popping up. You can go now. It leaves you in a place where you don't necessarily know what your film is for. Indulgence often comes with the presentation of stuff just because it's cool, or because it will be fun. That's as may be, but it doesn't make your story any better, it doesn't make your film any better. It shows you being a worse storyteller, actually. I often resent being shown something beautiful if the stuff around it has been presented to me in a stupid way, as I mentioned before. But it assumes a stupidity to the audience when things are over-explained or overdone, because it sort of assumes that people will need X amount of reminding and twatting over their head in order to get a point across, which is just not true. It simply isn't true. Trust your audience. Assume that they will pick up on the details which are made clear by the events and the images of your narrative. Let your characters have the room to be characters, and don't lessen them by making them do things you just want them to, or things that make them less believable. Respect your story and your characters. You end up with Babylon, which, as I'm sure you know, I come down on the side of that being absolutely terrible. It is so indulgent from Damien Chazelle. You can tell that this is the action of a man who pitched a story about the over-excess of glamour, and nobody tried to stop him making this series of over-choreographed set pieces under the guise of scenes, typecasting Margot Robbie as another I, Tonya type sociopath with evident issues, is dull. Making everything go at 1,000,000 miles an hour because you can is overindulgent and dull and makes your story worse. And you can tell it's overindulgent and sacrifices the storytelling for glamour and excess, because 2 hours into the film, you're given newspaper clippings to tell the story that flash up on screen. Nope. No. You've just shown me you failed at this. You are seriously telling me that over the last 2 hours of my life, you couldn't fashion a film which told me the information that was on this newspaper. You didn't work out how to drip feed me this so that I could watch it unfold in a succinct or intriguing manner. No, you couldn't, and I'll tell you why. Because you spent far too long indulging in the debauchery of the whole exercise because you thought it was cool and wild, and you forgot that you were meant to be telling me a story. And then, Chazelle has the absolute gall to do a bit where Margot Robbie goes into a bathroom and overhears generic Hollywood rude dialogue from people who didn't like her film. She overhears them through a door after 2.5 hours. For goodness sake. Was that not a clue that you forgot the story bit? An email into the Kermode and Mayo show called it a plotless, meandering pastiche of incoherent excess. And that's the most perfect summary. That summed it up better than I'll ever be able to. It was so ill-disciplined because it became utterly tedious. And that's a key link to make about Indulgence. It is literally a lack of discipline. You're becoming self-serving and worsening the quality of your story by failing to do the Roger Corman things yourself because you want to have all these cool things in it. And cool is the thing that I hate. Cool is like, I think it's cool, right? Do you think we're all going to think it's cool? Do you think we're all going to want to see this? No. Just no. Now, as I say, things can breathe, things can bathe in the world, things can take their time and let you fall in love with elements of whatever it is. Things can reinforce crucial elements or facets of a world or story by baking themselves and letting you take the time to appreciate them. And if you want your piece to be silly and pulpy and massively camp, then you can absolutely go and do that. But just know that it's really difficult to walk the line with both without sacrificing crucial parts of the story you're trying to tell. You can be pulpy, yes, but if you want to be long, you've got to find the balance. You've really got to find the balance. Take the time your story needs to tell itself, and commit yourself to creating the best version of that story. That way, you will inherently make people come with you. It's just what will happen. I say all of this, and Tarantino has made more money than I'll ever make, and has had more success than I could ever dream of having, so clearly I don't know anything. Also, Challengers wasn't even indulgent that much. It genuinely wasn't. It did have a fair bit in it, of course, and you can tell by the attitude of the director. But on the whole, I really liked it. Thought it was a lot of fun. I wasn't bored or put off. I mean, I found bits of it really silly, but it was earnest, and I believed in it, what it was doing, at the end of the day, and that is important. Those are my thoughts on indulgence and conciseness, and why it's important to be concise. I do very much hope I haven't lost the points of this particular discussion. I hope I've made it coherently, and I hope you go and watch Challenges because it's so much fun. As I said, with 3 incredible performances, they are brilliant. So, along with that, my recommendation for this week is Cleo from 5 to 7, directed by Agnes Varda, who captures the golden hour of Paris in the 60s through a portrait of a singer lost in the big city awaiting medical results. It's a great bit of cinema verite and melodrama with a great score, and it's just brilliant acting and directing all around, so it's an absolute must-see. She's nailed it. I recently went to see Happy Hour Live, the Jackmate podcast, and afterwards I had a chat with Jack and Stevie White in particular about how to keep consistent with podcasting, how to make this upload schedule that I should, hang my head in shame about, how to make that better. And they said pre-recording is an absolute must. Now, they've got an incredibly successful podcast who are currently touring the country, so they clearly know what they're doing. So I'm going to attempt to do that. What that means, however, is that upcoming chats and episodes may end up being a little bit more informal than previous, which I might end up hating a bit because I like these episodes to seem structured and well put together and eloquent, and I don't want to lose that, and I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so, you probably wouldn't believe it actually listening to this. But I like these to be good, I don't want to lose that, but I'm sure I'll find a way to do it properly in a way which still sounds good and is an engaging conversation. But I want to be a bit more consistent, and here is why. And this is the heartfelt bit that I wanted to say that I was talking about at the start of the episode. I am really proud of this podcast, despite all of its flaws and editing mistakes and dodgy jokes and, the most laughable upload schedule on planet Earth, my occasional northern twang on certain words, my voice being the focal part of it, which is criminal. But I am really proud of it. It means the world to me to have it, and I take a lot of care with it. I really do. It's pushed me to watch things I wouldn't watch before and think about things in perspectives that I wouldn't have otherwise thought about. And despite the fact that not many people listen to these episodes, I have genuinely felt moved by anyone who comes to talk to me about it, or the fact that they've listened to it. It is immensely kind of people to take even the slightest interest in what I'm yapping about, but it's so lovely, and you're all very, very kind indeed. I have started to expand what I'm doing film-wise into writing and being in short films where I can. I say, expanding. I've done 2 student films, and one of them, I was a horse. Let's not delve too deep into that, because I'm probably not going to plaster that all over the socials. These extra things that I'm doing are stuff that I might not have taken the leap to do if I hadn't proven to myself that I might know a little bit about this stuff, and that I can actually do this sort of thing, instead of just thinking about it in that daydream way that we all do and then never getting around to it. When you convince yourself you're actually going to be realistic, or, you imagine yourself doing something really cool and you go, that was good. What a daydream that was. Anyway, back to normal life, and you go, oh dear. Ironically, I'm not being very concise, and the whole point of this podcast was to be concise. I just want to say that this means a lot to me, and I care about it a lot. I put a good amount of proper effort into every one of these pods, which is probably why they're few and far between, because I want to do them properly, and, I've got a lot of other stuff going on. I want to prepare in the right way, and I don't want to just churn out something which is sort of half-arsed and doesn't cover the topic in the right way. So that's why my upload schedule is bad. I mean, I can still do more. I can still put more effort in, and that's what I'm going to have to do. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and do and put more effort into it. So, but I'm saying that's probably why, because I care about the quality of this stuff. A lot of what I've said on this podcast I already disagree with, but I'm 21 years of age. I'm still growing up and learning new things, and there's a billion more things I have to learn yet, and that's what's exciting, because it means that as long as I'm doing this, I will have new angles to see things and new things to see, and my opinion on other stuff might change, and it might evolve, and that's really exciting. I want to keep doing this for as long as I can. I'm determined to do so. So thank you for sticking around for 2 years already, and I'm very excited to bring more things to anyone who fancies listening. Right, I'll stop being a gimp now and say thank you for downloading the podcast. Look out for hopefully more frequent uploads, and I shall see you in the near future. Bye!